thank you so much, Devi, for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it. It was such a fantastic week of looking into the subject and obviously generally. I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then go straight into it. So Devi Lockwood has written about science, climate change, and technology for the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, and the Washington Post, amongst others. She spent 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents to document 1,001 stories on water and climate change. And this was funded in part by the Gardner and Shaw postgraduate traveling fellowships from Harvard and a National Geographic early career grant, which is really cool, actually. Lockwood graduated Phi Beta Kappa, sum cum laude from Harvard, where she studied folklore and mythology and earned a language citation in Arabic. And then in 2019, she completed an MS in science writing at MIT, and 1001 Voices on Climate Change, Everyday Stories of Flood, Fire, Drought, and Displacement from Around the World is her debut book. So thank you.
Yeah.
I've got to ask, where did you get your love of stories from?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. Stories, gosh, probably from my family, honestly. I think I come from a group of people who like to engage in the act of storytelling around the dinner table or on holidays. And, I've always been a reader and found a lot of comfort and solace in the ability of stories of all different kinds to transport me and to teach me. And I ended up deciding to study folklore and mythology in college because of a really incredible freshman seminar that I took called The Art of Storytelling. And there were just 12 of us, and we were sitting around a table and we had assignments to go home and compose a story entirely in our heads, or we'd learned about different global traditions of storytelling. And once I started paying attention to storytelling in that way, I found that I felt more alive in the world. And I think that that's what education can do at its best, right? But everything from the conversations that my family was having at Thanksgiving, where we would repeat the same stories over and over again, it used to annoy me, but then I was like, oh, we're solidifying our identity as a group by engaging in this ritual of resharing who we are and what that means. And similarly, just conversations I had when I was meeting new people in the dining hall, everything just became more alive. And so, continuing to think critically and creatively about storytelling has been just such an incredible gift.
That's amazing. And I was actually wondering because, it's like kind of chicken and egg situation. So were you a really good listener to begin with, or did the storytelling help to make you a better listener?
Oh, yeah. I would say I was kind of a mediocre listener to begin with. So the first leg of this journey and kind of the inspiration for the longer trip was a bike trip I did down part of the Mississippi River. And I was listening to stories people told me along the way. And I listened back to those recordings after and realized that I was interrupting people, kind of inserting myself and not fully listening. Instead, I was thinking about what I was going to say next or how I was next going to redirect the conversation. So I would say that, doing these 1,001 interviews for sure made me a better listener. It was a process of slowing down, figuring out how to direct my attention, and just being fully present with people.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of the fact that you took a bicycle around the world and with the sign around you, tell me a story about climate change and water. And, it's so fundamental and we don't really realize how personal it is. And I was just wondering, so it's a tricky one. And what do you think is the most destructive aspect of climate change?
I mean, it's one of those issues that's super complex and that it impacts different people in different places in different ways. And often the people who are impacted the most are those who have contributed to the problem the least and are also the least insulated by other forms of privilege to be able to, recover easily from those impacts. I was surprised by a number of common themes that emerged in kind of having this broad prompt, but listening to stories in 20 different countries on every inhabited continent where people live. And one of the main things is that climate change impacts both food and water security. And when you change where rainfall patterns fall or what time of year the rain falls, for example, that impacts where people are able to grow food, which impacts where people are able to live, and that both food and water security together are kind of drivers of migration. So there's climate migration, that it's either intensifying conflict or prompting people to leave the places they call home if they're able to. And that brings up, these bigger questions about cultural identity and whether, how much changes when people move. But I think that for me, the food and water insecurity driving climate migration was one of the most pressing things, and something I knew about in the abstract before I started, but it became so much more concrete in the process of listening to these stories.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like, there's three things that come out from that, which I was wondering, which is, first of all, do you think cultures can survive with obviously growing displacement and migration?
I think that there's some things that survive and there's some things that don't, right? The easiest or most ready example that comes to mind is right from the beginning of the book. I spent a month in Tuvalu, which is this low-lying coral atoll nation in the South Pacific. It's home to about 10,000 people, and they used to have a freshwater lens under the island where people could kind of dig a shallow well and have water for all of their needs.
Wow.
And that water became both salty and contaminated in the last 20, 25 years or so because of sea level rise.
Right.
And that has impacted the Tuvaluan way of life in a huge way, in that people have to rely on the rain and rainwater collection tanks for having fresh water for all of their daily needs. And when it doesn't rain, they're super vulnerable, right? And one thing that was really interesting for me is that there is a bit of a divide generationally, at least among the people who I spoke with, about how people are responding to this water insecurity. And for people in the younger generations, they, for the most part, are hoping to move. And there's a visa that's set up with the government of New Zealand called the Pacific Access Category Visa. It's specific for these low-lying island nations, and people can enter a visa lottery each year and have, permanent residency in New Zealand. And there's a big Tuvaluan expat community in and around Auckland. And then there's folks in the older generations who told me that climate change is happening, but it's an act of God. And furthermore, that they didn't want to leave the bones of their ancestors that were buried in the front yard, right? That was too much. And so there's things like that you can't bring with you, right? And for some people, making that leap is too much. But I think for folks who are younger, seeing their whole lives ahead of them, right? They see the way that this water insecurity exacerbates other problems, and they want to live in a place where that's not as much of a daily concern. So that's, one example of the impacts.
Yeah, and it's so weird because you mentioned this, and it just kind of jolted me, because I was just like, you forget this, which is the Earth is a water planet. I think, as you say, it's because we don't live in the water that we don't have the same respect for the water. And I've heard like multiple times, even in different scenarios, where I think what's his face, Michael Burry, who was one of the big short traders who traded against the housing market, is now investing in water as a commodity. And so I was just wondering, what do you think the impact of water will be in the future? Like, how do you think it's going to play out?
Well, water is kind of the center, one of many things that you need in the right amount, not in an overabundance, right? Because flooding is a different problem altogether, but you need in the right amount in order to be able to call somewhere home, right? So I think when we look at the ways that climate change is impacting water supplies, it's exactly that. It's impacting where people are able to live. I think there's also a lot of evidence that water insecurity makes conflicts worse. So, everything from what's happening to Ethiopia right now being exacerbated by a drought to, the ongoing conflict in Syria, which is also linked to problems with agriculture that started with changes in rainfall patterns, right? There's a lot of tension that can come to the surface, frankly, when water is not a given. And so I think that we can expect to see more of that, and similarly more migration, right? I think a lot of here in the US, the pressures that we're seeing on the southern border, again, it's conflict that is fueled by water scarcity or water insecurity or problems with food supply in Central America. And so it's all connected, right? It's like you tug on one thing and you get everything else with it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Actually, you reminded me of that, because actually the whole conflict between, India, Pakistan, Jammu Kashmir, China, it is a water insecurity issue.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite frightening to think that wars will be fought just to fight over clean water supply. And it's it's a worrying thought for the future. And I was kind of this was, I think, one thing I noticed, which is like when you went around and asked people their personal stories, and there's no sort of human element of climate change. I guess you hear from scientists what's happening, and then there was this really nice line that you wrote, which was what if we could paint the CO2, make each molecule visible in the sky? And do you think if climate change was more visible to everyone, do you think that it would change the conversation at all?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think it would. One of the most difficult things about climate communication is exactly that it's a kind of abstract issue that can feel kind of inaccessible to people. And it's about, the myriad impacts that these changes have, but it's hard to see what's driving those changes, because it's, emissions that are, it doesn't change the sky different color necessarily, right? It's so I think that one thing I have noticed in the 5 years or so I spent documenting these stories is that the impacts have become more intense, and I think more people are feeling them, and also more able to link things that they're seeing or experiencing, or that people that they know are seeing and experiencing, like floods and wildfires, for example, to climate change. And as a result, it's becoming a little bit easier to have these conversations because people know what the baseline is, right? Or what's happening. And so I think that as climate communicators, in the media and elsewhere, that we have a responsibility to use all of the tools at our disposal, whether that's good storytelling or metaphor or distilling abstract concepts in an accessible way that still maintains the nuance of the idea at hand. We need to do all of that. And then also there's just this huge responsibility of science educators to make sure that people have a baseline understanding. Of the few people I interviewed who we might call climate deniers, the commonality was a lack of trust in the science, which I think boils down to the topics being explained in a way that, relied on overused metaphors like polar bears and Calvin glaciers, but also kind of communicated a lack of just a gap in their science education.
That's really interesting. And and I guess there is this gap, as you say, between the climate change deniers and the people who are experiencing it themselves. And that's the thing. It's like, do you think people in emerging kind of nations have a sort of a greater understanding of climate change because of their sort of direct interactions with the land and water?
Yeah, I'd say it really depends, but to the extent that it's possible to make a generalization, the people who have experienced the impacts for sure are aware of what's going on, even if they're not using scientific language to describe it. There's a lot of awareness. I think that people are experts in their own lived experience, right? And there's a certain type of expertise and knowledge that comes from living in a place for a long time, even generations, right? And that is as valid a form of expertise as the climate science. And I think that those two things are the strongest when they're in dialogue with each other. And so that was my hope in this book, was to kind of put those types of stories side by side.
Definitely. And that definitely comes through in all the different stories, because there was such a varied experiences, from the rich north of Norway to obviously the Pacific Islands, where they don't have that as much resources. There was a huge divide you could see. But then thankfully there was this just general language where there was some kind of awareness something was happening.
Definitely.
And I was just wondering, like, this is a tricky one that I find personally really hard, which is, as someone who loves to travel and learn about other cultures and learn about other people's experiences firsthand, like, how do we do this without causing a massive carbon footprint?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, right? There's weighing individual responsibility versus collective responsibility, right? I think that the problems that have led to climate change are systemic, right? It's not your fault, it's my fault. Or it's not your fault, it's not my fault. It's the fault of fossil fuel companies, right? And that the people who have promoted this infrastructure uncritically, or even worse, knowing the impacts, but making it anyway. And I think that it's still possible to travel ethically if one prioritizes, targeting the systems that have led to this point, but also connecting with folks in a meaningful way that can perhaps spark climate conversations, right? And it was one thing I thought about really critically on this trip, right? I was flying a lot at the beginning, and even though I was traveling by bike when I got to wherever I was going. I met some climate activists in New Zealand who challenged me to, look up the carbon footprint of those flights. And so I did, and it was disproportionate to anything else that I could do in lifestyle changes, right? And so I tried not to fly for as long as I could. I lasted about a year and took 2 cargo ships and 2 sailboats, and had some really incredible experiences on the sea, but then ended up giving up and buying a cheap plane ticket after all of that, because it's just not, the infrastructure is not set up that it's easy to avoid these kinds of emissions if you are traveling. So I don't know, I think it boils down to awareness, to kind of only flying when it's strictly necessary, and to being as vocal about these issues as possible. I think one of the big problems, or one problem that's connected to many other things around climate change, is that we often don't know how to start conversations about these issues, right? So to the extent that travel can also be an intervention into climate silence, right? That we can prompt these kinds of discussions in our day-to-day lives, then that too is important.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, and something I realized I have to be constant about. It's not just like you do this once off and that's it. It's a constant sort of thing. And actually, I found this became very prevalent during this pandemic, isn't it? People became much more aware. That's what I found here, that, of their kind of carbon footprint. And do you think that the COVID has in a way helped people see their own carbon footprint?
I think there's a lot of impacts of the pandemic that we're still going to be untangling for a long time to come. For me, one of the big things that I see having a parallel to climate change is about the responsibility that we have towards each other, right? And seeing how these kind of global crises are really connected, and what's happening here in the States is absolutely going to impact someone in an island nation or someone an ocean away, right? So that sense of global connectivity, of global problem solving. Frankly, there's been some really disturbing inequities in how vaccines are distributed, which will probably mirror how climate responses to various disasters have happened in the past and will continue to happen in the future. But I think we need to keep all of those things in mind as we work towards solutions and act in a fast way to something that can feel kind of slow moving and maybe inevitable, right?
Definitely. And it was interesting because one thing I think, was it in Denmark where they were starting to kind of experiment on this island?
Yeah, in Samso.
That's it. And it was really interesting to see how well it was working. And I was just wondering, in a way, does population size make any difference to, dealing with climate change? Because obviously, you know, uh, Denmark, Sweden, Norway are very good in terms of they have a lot smaller population than a lot of places. And so they're able to kind of manage certain things like welfare systems and things like that. But then you've got a place like India, and you've got like 1.3, 1.4 billion people. So do you think is it more difficult to find solutions in this way, or is that more of an excuse?
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting that you bring up Samso because it's an island, right? And so it's bounded. The limits of the community are really well defined, and they were able to implement and kind of use it as a laboratory for some climate solutions, and kind of have branded themselves as this energy island. And I think that what's successful about that, or what might be worth thinking about or replicating, is that I think oftentimes the best climate solutions can be, or mitigation efforts can be, highly localized, right? So even if a place isn't an island, how can we bring that kind of thinking into that local context, right? What are the bounds of this one specific community? How can they come together? What are the things that matter most to them? And then from there, what actions might be taken, right? So from having that island mindset, I think that it ends up being beneficial to many people when in smaller places those kinds of conversations can happen in a deeper way.
Okay, I see. So in a way, it can be replicated, but just need to kind of change the way of thinking, which I hope.
And what's cool about Samso too is they have this energy academy, right, where people from around the world come together to study how they've been able to implement these renewable energy options. And not only that, but getting buy-in from the community, and so they lead workshops. And so it's that way of thinking that I think is the most important thing, more so than the size of any given place.
Yeah, no, definitely. And actually, just off the bat of that, is that would you say that we need to have more of these kind of discussions like COP26, but it needs to be much more often, because COP26 and COP generally doesn't happen very often. So do we need to have more of these kind of big summits more often?
I think that the more ways we can find to come together and talk about the issues and to create solutions together, the better. Absolutely. Does it need to happen at a huge international scale where everyone's flying in to be in one place at one time? I don't think so, right? I think it's very possible to connect both with people locally and far away using the tools we have at our disposal, like Zoom and other things. But yeah, on the whole, I would say that the more that we can be discussing these issues and collectively creating the future that we want, the better off we'll be in the long run.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that sounds like a really good idea, because I want to keep having this discussion. So it's really important. And
definitely,
we both live in places where, you're in the US, I'm in the UK, where, this fast-paced consumer life is really, really just always around us. And how do we convince more people, or even companies, to kind of stop striving for this kind of fast-paced life?
Well, I think it comes down to values, right? And thinking creatively about which values are shared. And there's some really incredible, folks who work in the corporate social responsibility space, but also are prompting businesses to think about their responsibility to not just profits, but people and planet as well, right? The 3 Ps, and that those things don't have to be working against each other. And so I think that within the business community, there has been some movement in that direction. It's just our responsibility as members of the public to raise our voices or vote with our dollars, or, you know, do our best to push organizations of all kinds that are large enough to have an impact or move the needle on these issues to do what they can.
Yeah, that's so true. And okay, so after all of your amazing stories, everything you've collected over the years, which one do you think, like, which story did you think affected you the most?
My answer to that question changes based on what day it is, but I've been thinking a lot, you know, on the topic of food security. Spent some time in the Canadian Arctic in Nunavut in a community called Igloolik that has just a couple thousand people living there. It's also an island, but they travel far both in the summer and the winter to follow the migration patterns of various species to hunt. And that's kind of the main source of food security in the community. It's so expensive to fly things like fruits and vegetables up there, right? But walrus meat is plentiful. But, you know, speaking with some elders in that community, I remember especially a conversation I had with a woman, I believe in her 70s, named Marie. Marie told me that, you know, she had hunted with her husband when he was alive over the course of decades, and they would hunt seal and they would hunt walrus, and they're just having to go farther and farther away to access that food supply. And that's connected to just changing temperature of the water and changing patterns of the way that the ice moves. And that, I think, is one example of many of how people's lives and livelihoods in many ways are at stake, and that we're entering this space where, you know, we don't have experience with dealing with this before. We're making it up as we go, but it's impacting people and their culture and their lives and their ability to eat, drink, things like that in really dramatic ways that we need to be talking about and prioritizing and amplifying those voices as much as possible. People are telling these stories. It's just a matter of listening, really.
Yeah, no, totally. God, I remember that story that you mentioned, and yeah, it's really tragic and really, like, it seems almost impossible, like, as an individual sometimes when you see these things, like, what can I do? And so I was asking people this week as well, it's like, what can we do as individuals to try and make things a bit better? What do you think?
I think having conversations about these issues as much as possible is a first important step. I would encourage people, if they're, you know, motivated to do something, to connect with, you know, climate groups in their area. There's lots of incredible activism that's happening to try to block fossil fuel infrastructure from being created, or to kind of sound the alarm bell that we can't keep burning these fuels. And then furthermore, just to kind of think about individual responsibility, but not be paralyzed by it, right? Because we're strongest when we work together to address these issues.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's where everyone starts feeling a bit overwhelmed, isn't it? Where you just
think,
God, it's just so much to think about.
There is, yeah. And it's not, the thing is, again, I don't know if I can emphasize this enough, but it's not like, it's not your fault, it's not my fault. I think even the idea of a carbon footprint, I think it was reporting out of Mashable that revealed this at first, but it was a PR stunt by the fossil fuel industry to get us to all think that it's our fault and not theirs. I'll pass that link on to you if I can find it.
Yeah.
But there's a sense to which, you know, it's important, yes, to consider our individual responsibility, but also to recognize that it is fully the fault of the fossil fuel industry. And that there's ways of demanding action that aren't quite so paralyzing and don't require just the same amount of taking it on as one person, which I think is a fast track to despair.
Yeah, for sure. That helplessness feeling definitely sets in pretty quickly.
Yeah, versus it's like really empowering to work with other people to try to take on these issues at a systemic level, right? So I think that's where, for me, where the kind of twang point is, where it's important to focus our energy and time.
Definitely. So what's next for you in your climate journey, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, continuing to talk with people about this book, and the paperback will be out next year. Excited about that.
Yay.
Giving talks at various places. And beyond that, I've been, it's not possible really to do so much in the way of traveling and reporting at the moment. I have been noodling around with a fiction manuscript that intersects with some of these themes. So we'll see if I can get that together. I'm doing at night right now, I'm doing the National Novel Writing Month, which is where you try to write 50,000 words in a month, which is like 1,667 words a day. It's not so bad.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it's been fun to be part of a community of writers kind of working on getting a rough draft in shape. But I don't know, we'll see. It's something I definitely think that intersects with pretty much everything. So in a way, almost every story is a climate story. And I work in journalism as my day job. So it's something that I'm excited to continue working on.
Excellent. And I saw that you have a website as well. Is that correct, for your stories?
Yeah, it's kind of like the baby version of the website right now. But if people want to listen to some of the stories from the book, they can go to 1001stories.org.
Perfect. That's awesome. We'll definitely do that. So thank you so much, Devi. I really, really appreciate it. Such an important topic in a stage of the world where we really, really need to be listening to this. So
yeah, well, thank you for having me.